Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our study about European absolutism by talking about the philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment. We're going to tie a little bit of this into the scientific revolution. Keep in mind that all of this is a process that's happening over a long period of time, so we're taking a break from our sort of chronological studies of societies, and instead looking at the way that humans construct knowledge and how that's been changing over time. So, here's our basic objectives for today, and let's dive in and talk through these various philosophies. So one of the things that happened with the European Renaissance, Reformation, and the scientific revolution is we started thinking about how we construct knowledge. As opposed to relying on sources of tradition and past understandings of things, or deductive reasoning by sort of looking at the world and making observations, instead we started developing this whole scientific method thing, where we're actually doing experiments and trying to figure out how things work and then inductively drawing conclusions from that. This scientific method of questioning, hypotheses, experimentation, and evaluation is going to change the way that humans construct knowledge and is going to lead to the breakdown of a lot of previous sort of systems that we use to understand the world. So rather than looking at the world and trying to find evidence that supports our already established conclusions, instead we're going to be making observations in order to build new systems of understanding. This is going to lead to a much more accurate understanding of the world, proving that just about everything that Aristotle understood was wrong, and instead we need to come up with new models to explore how the world actually works and how all of this stuff comes together. One of the biggest examples of this, and the guy that sort of put the scientific method into practice, is Galileo Galilei. Through a series of astronomical observations, he came to the conclusion that the whole idea that the Earth is the center of the universe and there's this dome of fixed stars out there is actually probably not accurate. The way that the planets move is inconsistent with that, and so he started to replace this idea of a geocentric universe, an Earth-centered universe, with the heliocentric model. The idea that the Earth and the Moon and the other planets revolve around the Sun as opposed to the opposite. This went against a lot of traditional thinking, but all the data that was collected fit the facts. Unfortunately, the world was not ready for this at this point, and Galileo was put on trial for his beliefs and was forced to recant and live the rest of his life under house arrest. But he did improve scientific thinking and establish that the scientific method was a reasonable way of drawing conclusions. All of this was built on by a guy named Isaac Newton, who replaced Aristotle's laws of motion, of violent versus natural motion. Aristotle had these two types of motion, basically the idea that all things naturally want to fall to the earth, and so things made of earth want to fall to the earth, and so that's why when you drop stuff it falls down. But if you exert a violent force upon it, it would move in another direction. And so Newton took away this idea challenged this idea of violent versus natural motion with his laws. So, one, the law that objects remain in its current state. The second law is that the movement of an object is proportional to the force applied upon it. And the third law is that all actions result in an equal and opposite reaction. So yes, gravity is pulling you downward, but you're not moving because the Earth is exerting an equal force upward. It's not actually about natural motion at all. This helped explain observations such as why objects that are shot out of a cannon, as soon as the cannon stops putting a violent force on them, don't immediately fall down, and instead continue in the direction that the force was applied. So, Newtonian physics and Newton's laws created this sort of our modern understanding of physics and replaced a lot of Aristotle's principles. We then started talking about the construction of knowledge in general. René Descartes decided to try to figure out what he could actually prove, and the conclusion that he came down to is all that he could decisively prove is that he was thinking about what he could prove. This, in the end, was the beginning of his knowledge, and so he came up with the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." He knows that he exists because he is currently thinking about his existence. All of these ideas spread across the continent in what's known as the Republic of Letters. In various capitals of Europe, these salons, these meeting places opened up. Educated people would spread ideas, and then they would write to each other, and then they'd build upon those ideas, and then they'd write to each other. And so this Republic of Letters created a network of learned people across Europe, spreading and building upon these philosophical, governmental, and economic ideas, furthering thought as communication often does, and different people take different ideas and then sort of bounce off of them. So Bacon and Galileo and Newton could all read each other's work and then put together and draw conclusions about science. In politics, we have people like Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' basic philosophy was that in general humans are evil. In the state of nature, humans will act with their base instincts like animals, and therefore governments, specifically strong governments, are necessary in order to control them. He grew up during the English Civil War, so it's understandable that he would have had a relatively negative view of human nature. And so here's an excerpt from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Pause, take it in, and then we'll move on. Montesquieu argued, on the other hand, that if you give all the power to one individual, it might create tyranny. And so he argued for a separation of powers, specifically into an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch, where of course, separating out all these powers will prevent tyranny. So we need to separate out the power of judging from the power of making laws and the power of enforcing laws. This, of course, we see present in a number of modern governments, and so the Baron de Montesquieu created the ideological and philosophical underpinning for a lot of the democratic governments we see today. Cesare Beccaria argued that we should have law codes that apply to everyone equally, and we probably should try to rehabilitate people with our punishments, try to get them integrated back into society, as opposed to just simply torturing people to get confessions. And so he argued for a stronger and proportional law code as opposed to the more legalistic systems that had been promulgated before this. Voltaire argued for the freedom of speech and freedom of religion and was very active in all these circles, traveling around and meeting with various monarchs, helping to inspire the whole enlightened monarch movement, which is going to come after this. And John Locke's social contract is going to become absolutely central to this. John Locke's social contract established that people give power to governments in order to have their rights protected, because when humans live in close contact with each other, their varying desires can lead them to oppress each other. And so he created what's called the non-interference axiom, basically that your rights extend to the point in which you are taking rights away from others. So you have absolute freedom to swing your fist around until that fist connects with someone else's face, then you are taking away their right to not get punched in the face. If governments misuse power, Locke argued that the social contract allowed people to replace/overthrow their governments, legitimizing governmental reform and popular rebellion. This would, of course, become essential in the American Revolution and the French Revolution going forward. So John Locke believed that governments and people enter into this social contract with each other in order to ensure that people's rights are protected, specifically the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Here's John Locke's 2 treatises on government. Take a moment and pause to answer questions about that, and then we'll move on. We also have some anti-Enlightenment philosophers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that humans were pure in the state of nature, and it was governments that corrupt people. And so instead of trying to find the most perfect form of government, Rousseau argued for a type of anarchism in which no governments would allow people to return to their pure state of nature. And we get pushes for economic reform. The French economic thinker Turgot and the Scottish economic thinker Adam Smith both argued for the removal of government constraints on the economy, arguing that all of these things simply increased inefficiency and prevented people from getting the goods that they wanted. So he argued against this mercantilist system, again arguing that the forces of supply and demand would eventually create an equilibrium price in which most of the people were getting the goods that they wanted at the price that they wanted it. So this creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This is what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, and he argued, again, for economic markets that were unfettered by political divides, by the divides at the Generalité and those tariffs, and government restrictions. So we start seeing some arguments for free market capitalism, which hasn't really emerged yet, but is going to in our future units. So the effects of all of this is we get all of these sort of philosophies mixing together, and governments are going to start trying to put these philosophies into action. We saw this a little bit in the English Revolution, although this happened too early to really bring in a lot of these philosophers. So as we go forward from here, we're going to look at how both monarchies and then eventually republics take these principles and try them out in the real world, trying to create a more efficient system of governing. So the Enlightenment is very much about taking the values of the scientific revolution and try to apply them to human government, human economics, human interactions, and things like that in order to try to create a more perfect world. So that's where we're going to go from here in future lessons. Thank you for listening.